And now a reading from one of the central religious scriptures of our time. I'm talking, of course, about Justice Harry Blackmun's majority decision in Roe v. Wade. Obviously, I am being a little sardonic here when I call Roe v. Wade a scripture, but I'm not speaking completely out of my hat here. One of the things that we have been arguing in this series on the history of natural law and natural right is that when you take away the explicit religious justification for rights, like rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, when you take that away, you start to speak gibberish. And the specific kind of gibberish that you start to speak is you start to use words that are expressly religious without any expressly religious content. Let me remind you a little bit what I mean by this. This came up when we were talking about the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights, right? That all of the words that are being used to justify things like human rights in our kind of modern international law and rhetoric, all of those words have a structure that points toward divinity, right? You have things like we are endowed with rights. Well, endowed by whom? We are a brotherhood of man. Well, if we're brothers, if we're all brothers and sisters, then who's our father, right? And what I've been trying to show you over the past 3 weeks now, I think this is probably going to be the last in our series on rights. We've been moving, starting in Genesis and moving all the way up to the present day to kind of ask this question: why is it that things that we currently do in the name of rights, like, for example, mass abortion, why do they become so horrific and so obviously in violation of higher goods and of natural law when they are supposed to be coming from natural law, right? So that's been the question throughout. I've been showing you, arguing to you that you can't just pull the rug out from underneath this tradition, and that I've been arguing that God is the rug, right? That we are standing upon a very specific foundation here. Over on Locals, my sort of VIP community of folks that are engaged in some deeper conversation about this stuff on Locals at youngheretics.com/locals, somebody pointed out to me a really great phrase. This was Charles said that Dennis Prager, I think, has the phrase "cut flowers ethics." And that's kind of related to what I've been saying, which is that you can't cut the roots off of the tree and keep enjoying the fruits. You can have the fruits for a little while, but eventually the flowers wilt and the fruit goes rotten and the tree stops bearing. Why? Because we have a specific history out of which these things come. And unless we acknowledge the logic of that history, we're going to end up talking ourselves in circles. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to become religious, but not towards God. So that's why I'm helping to explain, or trying to help explain here, why Roe v. Wade and abortion in this country have become not just matters of intense political debate, not just serious ethical disagreements among fellow citizens, but a question, a religious question. And it looks to most observers as if this is the religious fundamentalists, those Christians, those nasty Christians who want to stop women from having abortions on the one hand, and then the secularists, the unreligious, or those who want to not interfere with people's religious beliefs. But I'm arguing here that is an illusion, because all systems of thought contain a highest good. All ideas about rights contain inherently religious attitudes. And so if you try to cut God out of them, all you're going to do is end up worshiping idols. And I am, of course, not the first person to make this point about abortion, that from safe, legal, and rare, we moved into this sort of shout your abortion, ritual screaming, ritual keening, which again has very little to do ultimately with the difficult edge cases that we're always presented with, cases of rape and things like that. As I've said before, those exceptions were already built into the law. And so this is about something different. This is about the instantiation of the establishment of a new creed that doesn't know itself. The creed, the God that knows not himself, and the God of abortion is disguised, right? Is disguised because ultimately it's demonic, right? I mean, this is how this stuff works. And when you start talking about demons, right? Again, you sound like this religious kook, but the Bible, when it talks about demons, is just describing these phenomena, right? We think of it as like, oh, there's some sort of person with horns is going to swoop in, and maybe the last day that's what it'll look like. I don't know, but in the here and now, what it looks like is this insidious, slow process of erasing God out of the structure that he built and replacing him with other things. So that's why I call Roe v. Wade a foundational religious text of the abortion regime. And I'm going to read to you a portion of it now so that you can see what I mean. I know this is going to sound funny, but every time I have to wash dishes, I really love that I get to use this public goods soap that they make. They make all kinds of awesome stuff at public goods, and it all looks really good in the kitchen. But I was just thinking the other day when I was washing out, I had some like heavy duty cleaning to do. And it's just like so sleek. And I know that the product is going to work, which is not a guarantee if you're ordering stuff from Amazon or getting in the grocery store. You know, it's made with, clean ingredients. They make a ton of great snacks, by the way, healthy stuff like, chocolate covered almonds, which I just fiend on all the time. My cat, Chad Cat, loves the freeze-dried duck nibs. And I personally love saying freeze-dried duck nibs, so I make sure to mention them in every ad. You try to say it 5 times fast, I dare you. I worked out this great deal with public goods, which truly is a no-brainer. You can get $15 off your first public goods order with no minimum purchase. They are so confident that you will absolutely love their products, and so am I, that they are giving you $15 for free. You don't have to buy more than $15 worth. Just try stuff out. Go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout. publicgoods.com/heretics to receive $15 off your first order with no minimum purchase. It's free stuff. What do I have to do? Reach through the computer and give it to you? Go get it. Go check it out. Here's just a very short but pivotal paragraph from Roe v. Wade, 1973. This right of privacy, whether it be founded in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty and restrictions upon state action, as we feel it is, or as the district court determined in the 9th Amendment's reservation of rights to the people, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. The detriment that the state would impose upon the pregnant woman by denying this choice altogether is apparent. Specific and direct harm, medically diagnosable even in early pregnancy, may be involved. Maternity or additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed by childcare. There is also the distress for all concerned associated with the unwanted child, and there is the problem of bringing a child into a family already unable, psychologically and otherwise, to care for it. In other cases, as in this one, the additional difficulties and continuing stigma of unwed motherhood may be involved. All these are factors the woman and her responsible physician necessarily will consider in consultation. Now, I am not a constitutional lawyer. This is not going to be a fine-grained analysis of case law. You should look elsewhere for that. I am a cultural historian, right, and a deliverer of classical education. And for 3 weeks now, what I've been trying to do is equip you with the deep history of this stuff, going back thousands of years. How have we arrived at the point where we're thinking this way? And what has gone wrong? And what are we trying to recover? So whenever we start talking about rights, that's when my kind of bat signal goes off. And I start to think, well, okay, rights from whom? Who gives you the rights? The Declaration of Independence says that it is the Creator who endows us with them, right? And again, whatever your personal religious beliefs, that's the logic of the country that you're living in. And once you sweep that away, let us look at how you begin to worship other things. Because here's the thing about this paragraph that I just read from Roe v. Wade. It shows very clearly that from the beginning of this discussion, the safe, legal, and rare thing was always doomed to fail. Let me say why. There are, of course, different notions and conceptions of viability and how late is okay to terminate, quote unquote, terminate a pregnancy that have evolved since Roe, right then, and Casey, and these questions that have come up. I mean, Dobbs is involved with it too, because the Missouri law that Dobbs, the current Supreme Court case, addresses, I believe, makes it illegal to terminate a pregnancy, to have an abortion after 15 weeks. But why is it that this was always built in? Well, look at the reasoning that Blackman gives for why you might want to have an abortion. Maternity or additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed by childcare. All of these reasons, right, which have nothing to do with the actual threat to the life, the physical life of the mother, and have everything to do with quality of life of the baby and mother. And I said at the beginning that when you put the state in the position of evaluating the worth, the relative worth of human life, then you have departed from the traditional natural law, classical rights understanding, which is based on the imago Dei, the image of God, that all persons are endowed by their creator because they're made in God's image. They are endowed with the right to life. And so you can read in this paragraph that Blackman is not weighing the relative rights of two separate persons. He's looking at this one person, the mother, and he has already dismissed the notion that the baby in her womb is anything other than a clump of cells. And you note that he starts flipping between the child outside the womb, who may be, taxed with, who might be an undue burden and might have a bad life and all of these things. And of course, we acknowledge that there are many challenges, and a lot of Christian groups exist specifically to address these challenges. But note that he talks about it as a child there and not as a child in the womb, because the logic here is that the infant in the mother's womb does not have rights, right? And this is the sort of secret corruption, the secret corrosion, which is, I guess, not so secret anymore, inherent in this religious text, right? The right of privacy. We're talking here, of course, about substantive due process, right? The 14th Amendment says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Some people think that due process is the most important thing, meaning that you're just protecting certain legal procedures. But other people say, no, we're here, therefore, in the business of enforcing rights and making sure that the states don't violate specific rights, such as the right to privacy. So here's Blackman in Roe, right, attributing that right to mothers in such a way as to completely obviate and invalidate the very notion on which rights are founded, which is the idea that all men are endowed by their creator. The fundamental question is not whether the mother has a right to privacy. And we always have to come back to this in this debate. We have to insist upon it. The fundamental question is not, does or does not the woman have a right to bodily autonomy or privacy or whatever. I concede that she has all of those rights. The fundamental question is, are we dealing with another person, another human being who also is endowed with those rights? And once you get into that position, then you're thinking classically, then you're asking the natural law question, because you're acknowledging the foundation on which rights are built, which is, again, the universal, right? The fundamental equality of man and humanity in this respect, that if you are a person, you are in the image of God, and no man may take your life unjustly and without just cause, right? This is going back again to Genesis here, which, as I have shown, is the reasoning that stretches all the way through this long development of people arguing over rights. What are the rights? What rights do we have? Unless they come from the Creator and therefore belong to all individuals who are human, right? Unless that's true, then you've destroyed the foundation that you're standing on, and the flowers wilt and the fruit goes rotten. That's why this is a religion. And that's why it was built in from the beginning, even back in the 70s when it was supposed to be safe, legal, and rare. When you start talking about rights this way, as if they are the property of the state to confer upon those whom they deem to be persons, right? When you start talking that way, you've already baked it into the cake that you're going to open yourself up to nonsense and horrors. And that's, of course, what we're seeing, irrespective of the positions that people may hold and may argue in months and years to come about, which kinds of exceptions might or might not be legitimate to carve out from abortion law. So I want to begin with that by showing you the consequences, right, of when you pull that rug out, when you cut the roots out, right, what starts to happen? You start to worship other gods without knowing it. You become blind worshipers of idols rather than self-aware worshipers of God. And again, I'm not doing this to hit you over the head with my Bible or whatever. I'm telling you this so that you can understand the context, the long history and context of these questions. And so now I would like to turn in our last sort of time discussing this issue for now, I would like to turn to the question kind of in reverse. Well, if rights have this many thousands year history. And if you can't pull this block out without the building collapsing, if this is a load-bearing pillar, this divine endowment of all men with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and so forth, if you can't change that, then how can you ever reform, right? Because this is what I can imagine somebody, a goodwill objection from somebody listening to me, right? So maybe some of you out there are thinking, well, Spencer, it sounds like you just want to kind of lock the politics of like ancient Israel into stone and never deviate from them. And aren't you just kind of a conservative reactionary? And on top of that, aren't you a hypocrite because you live in all of these ways that no ancient Israelite would have sanctioned? So you obviously believe in some reform and change. How can you justify that when you're saying, well, you have to kind of like put the bedrock down and never deviate from it? And so I think that this is a really fascinating question, and we're now in a position to ask it because we understand kind of what the structure and the history of natural law and natural right thinking is. And there is, in fact, also a deep, rich resource of tradition for thinking about this very question, which is extremely live for us because of the issue of the slippery slope, right? When these big social reforms were underway in the 60s and 70s, when second wave feminism and, the Black power, Black liberation movements and so forth were demanding all this change, gay lib and all that stuff were demanding all these changes, right? There were all of these people saying, well, you're just setting off down a slippery slope, right? Once you open this door, you'll never be able to turn back. And the sort of liberals were like, well, you silly conservative fuddy-duddies. You say that all the time. Like everything that you say is always everything is always going to collapse, right? You can always see the seeds of destruction in everything. And I think that there is a point to that, right? I don't want to dismiss that leftist attitude out of hand because it is true that conservatives by nature, right, are, let's say, they have an instinctive reaction to change that shows them how it could all go wrong, how the seeds of destruction are here, right? And I've just been exhibiting that instinct in my reading of Roe v. Wade, right? So the leftists kind of mocked the conservatives when they said, you're going down a slippery slope. Nowadays, of course, people are looking back on that moment and saying, well, we are currently hurtling down a slippery slope, right? When you start getting people, arguing that you can execute infants after birth, like Peter Singer is, when you start getting people saying, well, we need to, teach children that boys can be girls and not let their parents interfere with them, right? These extreme and horrific excesses of all those quote unquote liberation movements look to a lot of people like they're proving the slippery slope, folks, exactly right. Well, I mean, here we are, right? Hurtling down the slippery slope that you said didn't exist. In fact, that was the very argument of the article I read a couple of weeks ago on euthanasia in Canada, right? You always deny the slippery slope exists and then you start hurtling down it because the sort of key is they say, well, nobody's arguing for some X crazy proposition. And the kind of caveat is, but not yet, right? There's this idea that conservatism is just liberalism driving the speed limit, and liberalism kind of sends us hurtling down these slippery slopes while denying that it exists, right? So all of these things seem kind of manifest to me right now. You can just look at our politics and see that we are on the slippery slope that they said didn't exist. And so again, that raises for me the question, well, okay, if reform is a slippery slope, then how can you move anywhere? How can you take any step? Do you have to just lock your laws in place forever, right? And so I want to now dig into the question, right? How do you do reforms without doing radicalism, right? How do you make changes to the law and make changes even, I think, to things that have been the same way for a long time without introducing the principle that will inevitably have no kind of limit and spiral wildly out of control? So I'm going to read to you now a few passages just to chew on and to start thinking in this direction, because this is going to be the beginning of something. I think that this is one of our fundamental political problems to face, and I'm not going to solve it here for you, but I want to enter into a conversation with you about how that reasoning can work. And we're going to start with my old pal, Uncle Aristotle. This is Aristotle's Politics. If you're new to the show, first of all, welcome. We're getting new folks all the time, and I really am delighted. But make new friends and keep the old. So if you've been around for a long time, I'm also very glad to have you. And you know who Aristotle is because we talk about him all the time. He's the student of Plato, Plato's best student. Plato was in turn Socrates' best student. And this is really the central and originary tradition of pagan Gentile philosophy in the West. Aristotle writes his Politics, which is in some ways the sequel or the companion piece to his Nicomachean Ethics, because ethics, right, is about character, ethos, how we are supposed to constitute ourselves to be good at being human beings. And then politics, politike, is about how you live in a polis, right? And a polis is a city, but it's more generally speaking, it's any structured human life together, right? It's a small c constitution of all the laws and practices that might lead people to cohere. And Aristotle famously says, man is a political animal, by which he means wherever there are humans, there are rules and customs about how they behave together. We're social beings is another way of putting part of this, and we're political inherently, not because like every human being was born with a picket sign in his hand or a gavel, but rather because as humans, as the organism that we are, because we're rational and because we're social, we engage in the doing of politics, the making of the polis. So here's Aristotle in Politics, Book 2, Chapter 8. Kind of a famous, I think it's actually an underappreciated part of the Politics. People don't read this enough, and they should, because it's the beginning of some really interesting questions about this issue that I've been raising. Right? Here's Aristotle. It may sometimes seem desirable to make changes. Such changes in the other arts and sciences have certainly been beneficial. Medicine, for example, and gymnastic, and every other art and craft have departed from traditional usage. And if politics be an art, we're talking here about a techne, right? So this is a craft or a set of techniques for doing things well, right? Sort of different from a science, an episteme, which has these fixed absolute rules that you can grasp perfectly with your mind. So geometry is an episteme, but a techne here is like a practical art. If politics be an art, change must be necessary in this as in any other art. That improvement has occurred is shown by the fact that old customs are exceedingly simple and barbarous. Here's Aristotle sounding a lot like a blue-haired lib, right? Old customs are exceedingly simple and barbarous. For the ancient Hellenes went about armed and bought their brides off each other. The remains of ancient laws which have come down to us are quite absurd. For example, at Cumae, there is a law about murder to the effect that if the accuser produce a certain number of witnesses from among his own kinsmen, the accused shall be held guilty. Again, men in general desire the good and not merely what their fathers had. But the primeval inhabitants, whether they were born of the earth or were the survivors of some destruction, may be supposed to have been no better than ordinary or even foolish people among ourselves. He's saying just because something was the beginning of your state, just, if it sprang out of the ground or if it was the survivor of a cataclysm to start afresh, these are sort of different ancient theories about how the first state might have begun in our current timeline, right? So just because they're old doesn't mean they're necessarily right? Such is certainly the tradition concerning the earthborn men. And it would be ridiculous to rest contented with their notions. He's saying we can't, there's no reason just to sort of stay with something just because we've been doing it forever. Even when laws have been written down, they ought not always to remain unaltered. As in other sciences, so in politics. It is impossible that all things should be precisely set down in writing. That's reminiscent, I shouldn't say reminiscent, but it sort of predicts Burke, right? This idea that you can't, if you try to nail things down in writing, you're inevitably going to create these difficult cases, things that challenge your general principles that you've laid down in writing, right? For enactments must be universal, but actions are concerned with particulars. Hence, we infer that sometimes, and in certain cases, laws may be changed. But when we look at the matter from another point of view, great caution would seem to be required. For the habit of lightly changing the laws is an evil. And when the advantage is small, some errors, both of lawgivers and rulers, had better be left. The citizen will not gain so much by making the change as he will lose by the habit of disobedience. The analogy of the arts is false. A change in a law is a very different thing from a change in an art, for the law has no power to command obedience except that of habit, which can only be given by time, so that a readiness to change from old to new laws enfeebles the power of the law. Even if we admit that the laws are to be changed, are they all to be changed and in every state? Are they to be changed by anybody who likes or only by certain persons? These are very important questions, and therefore we had better reserve the discussion of them to a more suitable occasion. So I'm going to stop reading Aristotle there, but I think he lays out here two really excellent principles because he both acknowledges that change is necessary and lays down a fundamental conservative idea, which I'm going to paraphrase as law is Lindy. If freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 4, then it is also the freedom to watch Matt Walsh's new documentary, What is a Woman? This is the question that the regime does not want you asking because it undermines the entire so-called logic, the self-defeating logic of gender politics or whatever you want to call it. Now that they want to say that a man can be a woman if it just feels like it or whatever, they are incapable of actually defining the word woman, to which they attach so much political importance. Matt has figured something out about this, which is so brilliant, and it breaks people's brains. So when you go to whatisawoman.com, you can watch him. I've been waiting for this doc ever since he told me about it. It's such a funny idea. He just goes and asks these people, like, you are so into like women's rights, women's liberation, whatever. What is a woman? And in some cases, sort of chillingly, they just say, well, there's no truth, there's no true or false. And then in other cases, he'll like go to, remote tribesmen in Africa and he'll say like, can a man become a woman? And they'll like laugh him to scorn. It's just a very, very funny concept and politically important. I mean, we saw it affecting Supreme Court hearings when when Marsha Blackburn asked Ketanji Brown Jackson, what is a woman? She was like, well, I'm not a biologist. Like they've sort of completely talked themselves into a corner here. Matt is great at sort of pointing up that absurdity. It's a revealing documentary. It's extremely funny. Whatisawoman.com. The regime doesn't want you to see it, but I do. Go to whatisawoman.com and check it out. So, what do I mean by law is Lindy? If you're very online, you might already know what I mean, but I'm talking here about the Lindy principle or the Lindy effect, which is basically that the longer something has stuck around, the more likely it is to keep sticking around. And that's, it's not necessarily a good thing, but it is sort of a paradox because you think, well, things get old and they die, right? And of course, this is true of humans. But even in humans, there are certain situations where if you live up to a certain age, you're likely to live 5 years more and so on and so forth. And with institutions and with principles, this is even more true. Like, people talk about going on walks is Lindy, right? It's been going on forever. It is very unlikely that people are going to stop going on walks anytime soon. And we can know that in part because it's been around forever. Aristotle's case here is a little bit different. And he's saying things that have endured have an inherent value, and you should try to keep them the same if you can, because changing things regularly, creating the habit of change in the state is itself a bad, that continuity is a good per se, right? And so that's this idea, right, that we do need to make some changes sometimes, but we also need to have more deference the older a thing is, right? And that we need to have an inherent love of habit and ritual in the state, right? Because obedience to the law is itself central, right, to all good politics. These are, I think, some really helpful foundational tools to get us started. As Aristotle himself says, they don't quite answer all the questions, right? They don't answer who decides. We have our own constitutional mechanisms in this country for notionally answering those sorts of questions, right? The elected legislature should change the laws. The courts should, review them and so forth. But Aristotle's principles here are going to be very useful as we start to turn forward also into modernity, because these two major court cases that I've been sort of mentioning throughout this series. One is Roe, which I just read to you, and the other one is Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized gay marriage and said it was illegal not to recognize gay marriages in any state. These have an interesting difference between them. I think that both cases, let me say up front, were wrongly decided in precisely this way, because they created a right that did not exist, and they did so in a break with our traditions, and kind of anti-Aristotelian break with our traditions. And in Roe, especially, as I said, it broke with the right in exactly the way that I have been criticizing for the past 3 weeks, right? That it took away the fundamental justification for rights while insisting upon rights, thereby creating a new and false and blind religion. I think that abortion is a moral evil. I think that a certain form of gay marriage or civil union between homosexuals is a good thing that should be recognized. But that is less relevant to our conversation right now, because what we're talking about is the court cases. And the other thing I want to talk about is public opinion. So the really interesting thing about Roe is that Roe v. Wade, which ostensibly, quote unquote, decided the abortion debate, actually entrenched people's passions on it. We have held very deadlocked on this debate. And if you go to, if you look up, Pew's data on this, public polling on this, really since Roe, we have basically reached this stasis that it seems like Americans are maybe a little bit more pro pro-abortion than anti-abortion, but all people, but like the passions, the strength of those passions is not the same. And whatever you feel, people keep feeling it, right? And they haven't had a chance to argue it out. They haven't had a chance to go through the legitimate processes that would enable them in a reasonable Aristotelian way to ask the question, well, is this a person? Does it have rights, right? By contrast, Obergefell created a different problem, which is that it made a decision that the people were already coming around to. Since Obergefell, unlike opinion on abortion, public opinion on gay marriage has been getting more and more positive. I think we're up to something like 70% now. And that's was already going on before the Supreme Court case. Many states had legalized gay marriage. Obergefell simply said it was illegal for one state not to recognize it. And this was also, I think, a terrible miscarriage of justice. But it was, in this case, a miscarriage of justice because it steamrolled over a decision that the people were already making and emboldened those who have no tolerance, right? The only reason to do this in the courts is if you can have no tolerance for dissent whatsoever. And that is why this gay rights movement has become so extreme. You can't refuse to bake cakes. You can't refuse to, both of these in their own separate way create an extremism. You have to force nuns to provide abortifacients, right? These extremes of intolerance that we're seeing, which is a hallmark of a dogmatic faith, right, of a religion, are both because the court stepped out of its role and invented rights without reference to our tradition, without reference to Lindy law in the Aristotelian sense. And I'm going to read now a quote from Antonin Scalia, the late Supreme Court justice, who speaks about this. Alito also speaks about it in some of his opinions, and we'll get to that. But let me just read Scalia, because I think this is a really great quote. This one is about abortion, about Roe v. Wade. He says, "By foreclosing all democratic outlet for the deep passions this issue arouses, by banishing the issue from the political forum that gives all participants, even the losers, the satisfaction of a fair hearing and an honest fight, by continuing the imposition of a rigid national rule instead of allowing for regional differences, the court merely prolongs and intensifies the anguish. We should get out of this area where we have no right to be and where we do neither ourselves nor the country any good by remaining." Here's something that Alito said. Actually, I will just go straight into reading Alito because it's relevant, right? He said basically the same thing about Obergefell in one of his previous decisions, that by doing it through the courts, the gay rights lobby steamrolled over religious objections that could have been adjudicated more legitimately in the states and among the individuals, where it's quite likely, right, you can have a more fine-grained respect for the traditions and the local customs of the states. That's another dimension, right, of Aristotle's argument, is that when you have done things a certain way, it's not that you can't ever change them. It's that you need to be careful, right? It's sort of Chesterton's fence, which I talk about all the time. On Locals, we have a drinking game that whenever I mention Chesterton's fence, you have to take a drink. But this, we haven't yet gotten, I don't think, to answering or trying to answer this question. So, okay, you got to be careful of Lindy law. You got to watch out for the habit of obedience, right, which is in itself a good. But how do you, once you undertake to actually make a change, if you determine that a change is necessary? So in a bit, I'm going to use the example of voting rights for women, right? And you might also talk about voting rights for Black people before that, right, for the freed slaves, which was the issue that got Lincoln killed, right? So that was a hotly contentious issue. Once you identify that something which has been the same for a long time does need to change, right? And voting rights for women is a pretty fundamental one, right? It speaks about the nature of the sexes at a very deep level, and that was why people were concerned about it right up until 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified, right? You do start to have to ask, well, so how can we tell whether by making this deep-seated change, we are unsettling the foundation of our regime and of our traditions, like Roe, or we're actually unfolding those traditions in an unpredictable but consistent way? And this is a difficult question, but I have a few sources to read for you about the discernment process that needs to be done, because it is a discernment process. There's no getting out of sophisticated attention to this, right? There's no getting out of care and a certain degree of training of the sensibilities, right? Of training lawyers to think in these terms, right? Which is, again, why, though I am not a lawyer, right, I think that this this cultural history has a crucial contribution to make to the debate because, right, it informs the sensibilities of the people who will then be trained to make these sorts of decisions when they come up. So let me read to you now from my man Chesterton, and I'm going to read to you three sort of religious theorists, and they're talking about the changes in church doctrine, although actually one of them isn't, but it will all apply to changes in law as well. And they're three religious theorists who are writing about how to change things and what happens when the church or the law changes. Here's Chesterton in Orthodoxy. And this is from 1908, so early 20th century, shortly, in fact, before the women are given the right to vote in America. This was the big fact about Christian ethics, the discovery of the new balance. Paganism had been like a pillar of marble, upright because proportioned with symmetry. Christianity was like a huge and ragged and romantic rock, which, though it sways on its pedestal at a touch, yet because its exaggerated excrescences exactly balance each other. There's a word for you, excrescences. It's from the Latin cresco, meaning to grow, and ex out. So these sort of protrusions, right, and protuberances. Excrescences exactly balance each other. It is enthroned there for 1,000 years. In a Gothic cathedral, the columns were all different, but they were all necessary. Every support seemed an accidental and fantastic support. Every buttress was a flying buttress. So in Christendom, apparent accidents balanced. Becket wore a hair shirt under his gold and crimson, and there is much to be said for the combination, for Becket got the benefit of the hair shirt, while the people in the street got the benefit of the crimson and gold. It is at least better than the manner of the modern millionaire, who has the black and the drab outwardly for others and the gold next his heart. But the balance was not always in one man's body, as in Becket's. The balance was often distributed over the whole body of Christendom. Because a man prayed and fasted on the northern snows, flowers could be flung at his festival in the southern cities. And because fanatics drank water on the sands of Syria, men could still drink cider in the orchards of England. This is what makes Christendom at once so much more perplexing and so much more interesting than the pagan empire, just as Amiens Cathedral is not better but more interesting than the Parthenon. If anyone wants a modern proof of all this, let him consider the curious fact that, under Christianity, Europe, while remaining a unity, has broken up into individual nations. Patriotism is a perfect example of this deliberate balancing of one emphasis against another emphasis. The instinct of the pagan empire would have said, "You shall all be Roman citizens and grow alike. Let the German grow less slow and reverent, the Frenchman less experimental and swift." But the instinct of Christian Europe says, "Let the German remain slow and reverent, that the Frenchman may the more safely be swift and experimental. We will make an equipoise out of these excesses. The absurdity called Germany shall correct the insanity called France." This is wonderfully Chestertonian articulation of Westphalia, right? Of the idea that after the Protestant Reformation, we're going to have a religious non-aggression pact that also translates into a cultural and political non-aggression pact. So we don't dissolve into European war again, which, that didn't work out so great. But in fact, the idea of Westphalia, which is the idea of nationalism, right, is what Chesterton is getting at here. And he's saying, right, that it's an expressly Judeo-Christian, as distinct from pagan attitude, to let people develop kind of these, we call the states in America experiments in democracy. And it's kind of the same idea, because they will counterbalance one another and you'll reach a medium, not by making everything lukewarm, but by making each thing the most itself that it could be. Now, here's Chesterton again. Last and most important, it is exactly this which explains what is so inexplicable to all the modern critics of the history of Christianity. So now we're getting into reform and change. I mean the monstrous wars about small points of theology, the earthquakes of emotion about a gesture or a word. It was only a matter of an inch, but an inch is everything when you are balancing. The church could not afford to swerve a hair's breadth on some things if she was to continue her great and daring experiment of the irregular equilibrium. Once let one idea become less powerful, and some other idea would become too powerful. It was no flock of sheep the Christian shepherd was leading, but a herd of bulls and tigers, of terrible ideals and devouring doctrines, each one of them strong enough to turn into a false religion and lay waste the world. Remember that the church went in specifically for dangerous ideas. She was a lion tamer. the idea of birth through a Holy Spirit, the death of a divine being, of the forgiveness of sins, or the fulfillment of prophecies, are ideas which, anyone can see, need but a touch to turn them into something blasphemous or ferocious. This is very much akin to what I've been arguing about the notion of rights, that it's subtle, right? The way that God is kind of swept out of them. And you could almost not notice them because it seems like a natural development, but we are now 50 years into seeing that it is not. It's an aberration and a horror, right? And so what I'm arguing is, how do we go back to the source of what made rights great while proceeding on the wild course of experiment and change that Chesterton is talking about? Well, I think he has some good comments on that going forward. He says, the smallest link was let drop by the artificers of the Mediterranean, and the lion of ancestral pessimism burst his chain in the forgotten forests of the north. Of these theological equalizations, I have to speak afterwards. Here it is enough to notice that if some small mistake were made in doctrine, huge blunders might be made in human happiness. Aquinas, in an essay, he quotes Aristotle by saying that a small error in the beginning creates a great error in the end. And this is similar to what Chesterton is saying here, right? A sentence phrased wrong about the nature of symbolism would have broken all the best statues in Europe. A slip in the definitions might stop all the dances, might wither all the Christmas trees, or break all the Easter eggs. Doctrines had to be defined within strict limits, even in order that man might enjoy general human liberties. The church had to be careful, if only that the world might be careless. This is the thrilling romance of orthodoxy. People have fallen into a foolish habit of speaking of orthodoxy as something heavy, humdrum, and safe. There never was anything so perilous or so exciting as orthodoxy. It was sanity, and to be sane is more dramatic than to be mad. It was the equilibrium of a man behaving behind madly rushing horses, seeming to stoop this way and to sway that, yet in every attitude having the grace of statuary and the accuracy of arithmetic. I like to cite and think of this passage whenever you guys on YouTube make fun of me for moving around a lot when I talk. It's the grace of statuary and the accuracy of arithmetic. The church in its early days went fierce and fast with any warhorse, yet it is utterly unhistoric to say that she merely went mad along one idea, like a vulgar fanaticism. She swerved to the left and right so exactly as to avoid enormous obstacles. She left on one hand the huge bulk of Arianism, buttressed by all the worldly powers to make Christianity too worldly. The next instant she was swerving to avoid an Orientalism, which would have made it too unworldly. The Orthodox Church never took the tame course or accepted the conventions. The Orthodox Church was never respectable. It would have been easier to have accepted the earthly power of the Arians. It would have been easy in the Calvinistic 17th century to fall into the bottomless pit of predestination. It is easy to be a madman. It is easy to be a heretic. It is always easy to let the age have its head. The difficult thing is to keep one's own. It is always easy to be a modernist as it is easy to be a snob. To have fallen into any of those open traps of error and exaggeration which fashion after fashion and sect after sect along the historic path of Christendom, that would indeed have been simple. It is always simple to fall. There are an infinity of angles at which one falls, only one at which one stands. To have fallen into any one of the fads, from Gnosticism to Christian Science, indeed would have been obvious and tame. But to have avoided them all has been one whirling adventure, and in my vision the heavenly chariot flies thundering through the ages, the dull heresies sprawling and prostrate, the wild truth reeling but erect. I'm sorry, that passage chokes me up. I really think it's good, and I know it's so abstract. It's funny to get teary-eyed about something so metaphorical and abstract, but I really think it's a beautiful expression of something that is so rarely acknowledged, including and maybe even especially in conservative circles, right? That freedom is so messy and so dangerous. It's so much easier, right, to lock things in place or to just go wild, right, with every possible indulgence. But to make changes or to tinker with things while insisting upon orthodoxy is the stuff of life. That's how you stay alive, even though one wrong step, right, can blow you up. This is why it's so dangerous and so exhilarating to be having this very conversation. You may not know it, but you are probably spending a lot of money on subscriptions that you don't use, which is why you need Truebill. On average, Truebill saves people up to $720 a year just by combing out those subscriptions that you get sort of huckstered into that you really don't need or want to use. Like, I don't know if you remember, but a while back, everybody was on FaceApp because they were doing this thing where it was like, automatically aging your face or whatever. And in order to do that, you had to sort of sign up for this service, and they just roll you right on into the paid service without you're having to like check in on it at all. And so you end up paying for Netflix, for DirecTV, for whatever. Truebill will scrub through this and just help you to cancel all the stuff that you're not using. One of their customers, Matt B, says, I saved $660 for the year on DirecTV, saved $120 for the year on SiriusXM, and $840 a year on car insurance. This stuff really adds up. So don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at truebill.com/heretics. That's the special link for my listeners, truebill.com/heretics. It could very well save you thousands a year. Truebill.com/heretics, so that your ex doesn't keep you paying for Netflix that you're not using. Having read that rip-roaring Chestertonian passage, let me read another, I think, equally worthwhile, although perhaps somewhat more staid and decorous writer, and that's John Henry Newman, who's from a little earlier. This is his essay on the development of Christian doctrine. It's called an essay. I mean, it's book length, but it's really worth reading. This is an originally Anglican and then Catholic priest, much beloved among Anglicans and Catholics alike. And he has this to say, kind of famous passage about this very question of making changes to things that might go terribly wrong. He says, an idea not only modifies, but is modified, or at least influenced, by the state of things in which it is carried out, and is dependent in various ways on the circumstances which surround it. Its development proceeds quickly or slowly, as it may be. The order of succession in its separate stages is variable. It shows differently in a small sphere of action and in an extended. It may be interrupted, retarded, mutilated, distorted by external violence. It may be enfeebled by the effort of ridding itself of domestic foes. It may be impeded and swayed or even absorbed by counter-energetic ideas. It may be colored by the received tone of thought into which it comes, or depraved by the institution of foreign principles, or at length shattered by the development of some original fault within it. So there's the danger, right, that Chesterton was talking about too. But whatever be the risk of corruption from intercourse with the world around, such a risk must be encountered if a great idea is duly to be understood, and much more if it is to be fully exhibited. It is elicited and expanded by trial, and battles into perfection and supremacy. Nor does it escape the collision of opinion even in its earlier years, nor does it remain truer to itself, and with a better claim to be considered one and the same, though externally protected from vicissitude and change. It is indeed sometimes said that the stream is clearest near the spring. Whatever use may fairly be made of this image, it does not apply to the history of a philosophy or belief, which on the contrary is more equable and purer and stronger. When its bed has become deep and broad and full, it necessarily rises out of an existing state of things, and for a time savors of the soil. Its vital element needs disengaging from what is foreign and temporary, and is employed in efforts after freedom which become more vigorous and hopeful as its years increase. Its beginnings are no measure of its capabilities, nor of its scope. At first, no one knows what it is, or what it is worth. It remains, perhaps for a time, quiescent. It tries, as it were, its limbs, and proves the ground under it, and feels its way. From time to time it makes essays in which fail, and are in consequence abandoned. It seems in suspense which way to go. It wavers and at length strikes out in one definite direction. In time it enters upon strange territory. Points of controversy alter their bearing. Parties rise and around it. Dangers and hopes appear in new relations, and old principles reappear under new forms. It changes with them in order to remain the same. In a higher world, it is otherwise. But here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. Those are the famous lines. It changes with them in order to remain the same. In a higher world, it is otherwise. But here below, to live and to change, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. This is the crucial element that both liberals and conservatives can miss because it's so narrow. The gate is so narrow here, right? When Burke talks about the divine right filtering through. He's sort of channeling Aquinas, right? Filtering through like light through a window into the world, and needing to be returned to and re-understood in each new circumstance. This is the political virtue of prudence, phronesis, right? Practical wisdom. It's because we, in Plato's terms, we live in the realm of that which is perpetually changing. You might make a distinction between the world of being and becoming, right? Plato talks about the forms which exist in perpetual being, and we who are always changing, always decaying, always passing away, as Heraclitus observed, right? And because that's true, even though the right and the true and the good remains the same, we change, and we are constantly falling away from and decaying away from our understanding of the truth, unless we return to the source of it and try to expound it anew in the here and now. And I will say, giving, I guess, some credit to the Supreme Court, which I've been kind of hammering on recently in these episodes, that is ostensibly the idea that they have. They've just been doing it kind of badly because they've taken away, I think, the crucial plank, right? The essential plank of God. And historical analysis, like the kind we've been doing, right, is part of how you determine which of these planks are essential. You see, well, when you take this away, what happens, right? And what I've been arguing is that the God plank is indispensable, right? You can't cut it out. And Newman and Chesterton are giving us a kind of sense of how we might do this kind of politics by looking back at the eternal truths and modeling our changes in the here and now on them. Progressivism, right, is precisely the opposite idea, that like all change is kind of in a forward direction and is good. All regression is backward in time and therefore is bad, right? All return to tradition and so forth. But in some cases, returning to tradition is exactly what's necessary. That's why you get people saying online, return, right? And so those kinds of changes are not progressive at all in the sense of always moving in the same direction. They are traditional and true in the sense of always looking in the same direction, which is at the fixed North Star of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And when you're looking at that fixed North Star, you're always having to navigate in the world because the world is always changing. So there are still going to be reforms. There might be drastic reforms and wild reforms. And yet, you'll be able to tell, right, by careful reasoning, by prayer and discernment, whether you are looking at the North Star and traveling toward it, or whether you're just traveling, right, for the sake of traveling because you're a progressive and all change is good. Let me now read to you one more passage about how to discern these changes. And then I'm going to close with a few extra remarks of my own. Lewis writes in The Abolition of Man, sorry, this is C.S. Lewis, I should say. I feel like I can just cite him as an old friend now because we've talked about him so much. But C.S. Lewis, the great Christian apologist, Abolition of Man, also 20th century. A theorist about language may approach his native tongue, as it were, from outside, regarding its genius as a thing that has no claim on him, and advocating wholesale alterations of its idiom, and spelling in the interests of commercial convenience or scientific accuracy. This is one thing. A great poet who has loved and been well nurtured in his mother tongue, that's a quote from Keats, may also make the great alterations in it, but his changes of the language are already made in the spirit of the language. He works from within. The language which suffers has also inspired the changes. That is a different thing, as different as the works of Shakespeare are from basic English. Elsewhere in this text, Lewis talks about the difference between saying to a man, you have enjoyed eating bread, now try eating a sandwich, right, on the one hand, versus you have enjoyed eating bread, here are bricks and worms, try eating those, right? This idea of change from within the tradition is the only sustainable model of reform. The idea that from within the logic, and in order to do that, you have to be well nurtured in your mother tongue, as Lewis says, which means you have to steep yourself, and especially your lawmakers have to steep themselves in the history of where these things come from, so that as we are changing, we're also changing in order to stay the same, in Newman's words. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this from this question of the women's rights, women's liberation movement, or whatever. And then we, as I say, I'm outlining here a scheme, and I'm going to refer back to it a lot, especially because going forward next few episodes, we're going to be talking about technology a lot, because that's one of the areas of greatest change and greatest challenge for us. And it's an area of great interest to me. And I think that like this framework is basically going to give us some of the roadmap here. That's why I've been spending time on it. That's why I've been working my way to it for 3 weeks. And I hope that it will help you in your actual life about like, well, is the metaverse good, or is it, so we're gonna get to some of that. But let me address another kind of practical recent history thing, and this is the women's so-called liberation movement, feminism, whatever. Traditionally, you talk about first wave feminism as the fight for women's suffrage. And this was kind of closely tied up in America with the Quaker fight for abolition of slavery. And so there's some interesting kind of rhetorical union between the abolitionist union, this bondage, remove the bondage of these slaves and remove the bondage of these women in marriage, right? And so I want to read to you from the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. This is 1848. It's a kind of pivotal document of American early feminism, first wave feminism, which again ends in 1920, really, for all intents and purposes, with getting the right to vote. And feminism doesn't really take off again until the 60s and 70s. That's another story for another day. Let me read the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, just a portion of it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. So, obviously, right, this is the Declaration of Independence, just rewritten very slightly in a feminist context, right? And what's the change? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. What they're saying here, what they're arguing implicitly, is that the meaning of this document, that no meaning is ever contained in just like the words on the page. There's always the spirit. The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life, as Paul says. And they're saying the spirit of this document supports unfolding the word men into men and women. And they're saying that's what the founders meant, right? They were talking about the species of human, right? And they were talking about rights that attach to all human beings. And you can prove that this is true by noting that their Creator endows them with rights. And if we go back to the history of the Creator, right, we find in Genesis that man was created in God's image, male and female, right? And so there's an excellent case to be made that men and women are therefore, being both created in the image of God, are equal in these respects. They may be totally dissimilar in a million other respects, unlike one another in every other way, but as members of the human species, they are stamped with the image of God and therefore equal. And so they're making an argument from within the tradition here. They are making an internal argument for reform and change, because they're making, as I said, it's a big ask they're making. They're saying we want the right to vote, which is, male suffrage is been the norm, right? And the difference between the sexes is foundational to civilization, which I agree with and believe in. So why do I, as somebody who fundamentally believes that men and women are very, very different, why do I agree with this part of the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments? It's because I can see that it is taken from the logic, the very logic that tells me that men and women have rights, that tells me that men and women are different, right? This tradition, which I live in, which has schooled and shaped me, teaches me that this is a natural development, even though it's never been seen before. It's like a tree growing a flower, right? If you just watched a tree, if you've never seen a tree before, and you sort of watch a tree grow, well, there's these shoots, and we've got these branches, and they're kind of growing and growing. And then spring comes, and the tree does something you could never have predicted in a million years. Never would you ever have said that the tree would have this like pink explosion at the end of its branches, right? And yet you look at it, if you've known the tree from its youth, from its infancy, you know that this is a natural development. If the tree suddenly started dropping bombs, you would say something unnatural is happening here, right? Something that violates the law of nature. That's what these reforms are like. They're reforms from within the tradition, which unfold its logic in a demonstrable way through its history. And so this is why, although some people have recently, some women have sort of semi-jokingly argued for the repeal of the 19th Amendment because women tend to vote in ways that conservatives don't like, right? Nevertheless, I have to recognize that this is what Newman is talking about when he says that when the principle first emerges, it's colored with its local dirt. It just looks the way that it happens to have emerged and then becomes purer and clearer. This is a good argument that they're making in the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. Now from the same document, let me read a bad argument. They go on to try to continue rewriting the Declaration of Independence. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. Now, maybe they just got carried away with the rhetoric. I don't know, but actually, I do know because I've been studying feminism lately, the history of feminism. These two things have always been in the movement from the beginning: the good stuff and the bad stuff. They've been intermingled together, but they are different, and I want to show you why, so that we can think about what reforms are good and what reforms are bad in our future. Right? They're different because this next statement that all of history is just man against woman, right? Man oppressing woman. That is destroying the ground on which they stand. They're basically condemning the entirety of human history, that the things that they aim to change are not just worthy of change, but are evil and wrong and bad. But if the logic of your reform invalidates and destroys the logic of everything else, right? If everything that went before you was oppressive and wrong, then you've rid yourself. You've destroyed everything that you would ever refer to, that whole tradition out of which the flowers can grow, right? Out of which the tree can bear fruit. You've destroyed it in the utterance of your demand for change. And the dark, sad irony is that you're demanding change only because you were informed by that very tradition. And so to condemn the entire history of mankind as you ask for a change in the Western tradition is to cut off your nose to spite your face. And so these are two different lines of reasoning in one document, and I'm trying to show how you can identify them by using the rubrics that we've been talking about now for an hour from Newman and Chesterton and Lewis, right? By understanding what it means to change in order to stay the same, even within a single document, you can discern. It's not impossible to recognize a good reform from a bad reform with reference to the absolute truths of natural law and natural right. That concludes this series on natural law and natural right. I hope you have found it useful. We are going to make use of it going forward, as I said. But for now, let us turn to a mailbag question on locals about women. Now that Lent is over and I am drinking caffeine again, Gold River Trading Company has become a staple of my life. I was already drinking their non-caffeinated stuff, their chamomile tea and some of their herbal teas. But man, the 1776 American breakfast black tea is bonkers good. It is totally to die for. It comes in these really cool packages, and it's really hard in the States to get good tea. This is good tea. Take the word of somebody that has spent a lot of time living in the UK, where tea is like they basically hook you up to an IV drip when you cross the border in the airport. And this stuff is the real deal. When you go to goldriverco.com, you can get 10% off by using the promo code Heretics, Heretics, at goldrivercode.com for 10% off. I've been getting really great feedback on this one. People have been sending me pictures of the tea that they bought and saying they really enjoyed it, which I'm not surprised because they have a bunch of flavors besides just the ones I mentioned. Gunpowder green tea is another great one. Go check them out at goldriverco.com and make sure you use the promo code Heretics, Heretics, so that you can get 10% off. Mailbag questions come to me on locals. I mentioned some of the conversations we've been having on there lately already. Just to reiterate, it is a fabulous community of VIPs. When you go to youngheretics.com/locals, you can come join us. We do live stream Q&As. I'm writing a translation and commentary on Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans, which has been really fun. And just in general, it's a great group of friends and fellow travelers who love to discuss these profound issues. And I want to read now a question from Falderall. I'm gonna air him out now, as they say. I'm gonna drag him on the podcast. Falderall at our weekly live streams writes these novels. It's like there's a character limit. He always has to fulfill the character limit, asking these incredibly elaborate questions with metaphors and sort of commentaries upon prior philosophical problems, like the ship of Theseus or whatever. And I have to say, I love them. I find them super fun. I also have this sort of sad experience that I'll like answer them in some length and in some detail. And then he'll be like, well, you seem to have misunderstood the question. So Falderall is a great asker of questions. And I just want to give you that context so that you can understand how uncharacteristically pithy this question is. Falderall says, how would you answer Matt Walsh's question of the century? What is a woman? So if you have not been checking out Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman? And just in general, the way that he breaks people's brains by asking this question, right? We saw already, Marsha Blackburn, I think it was, from here in Nashville, from Tennessee, asked Ketanji Brown Jackson to define a woman, right? And so this trend of asking gender goblins, crazy gender people, to say what's a woman has been undermining the very logic of everything that they say, because they're constantly talking about women's rights, womanhood, right? I am a woman, but they can't say to you what a woman is. Just like whoever I feel, like a woman is somebody who defines himself as a woman. It's like a cat is a cat. This is, a serious undermining of the most remedial logic. And so Falderall, I suspect, is asking me this question because he knows that I talk not just a lot about women, as I have been doing on this episode with Seneca Falls and feminism and stuff, not just about women, but also about femininity, right? And things that you might, if you were sort of this way inclined, you might call gender, right? Not just sex, but gender. I'm going to get to that distinction in a second. But first, let me say that the answer to what is a woman is obviously a human being, an adult human female, right, with XX chromosomes and stationary gametes and whatever. Like, you can give the biological definition, but also you don't even need to, because everybody knows what a woman is and always has been able to identify them, right? So like I will stand by, like, the stationary gamete answer, but I will also say, and let me explain why, that you don't even need to make reference to complex biological terms. You don't need to be a biologist. Like, everybody can see there's men and women. They have different parts, different behaviors. And when you start saying this, the left will always be like, well, but what about intersex people, and what about women born with like androgen hypersensitivity and so forth, so on and so forth. And my answer to this is the same rhetorical move that all postmodernists make. They take these tiny 1% exceptions and then act as if that explodes the possibility of categorization. It's like if you say, well, there's such a thing as a tree and there's such a thing as a bush, right? And then they'll be like, well, there's some bushes that are really big. Like, are they trees or bushes? Like, there's some trees that are really small. Are they bushes or trees? And it's like, okay, fine. Like, there's every word has fuzziness around the edges, but unless the edges delineate a real category, all speech is impossible, because language just functions this way. It designates and delineates certain things, which, if you zoom in close enough, the outlines of them are blurry. If you look at the Dover coastline from an aerial map, right, you can see a clear line. If you zoom in, you see a lot of little squigglies, right? It gets more and more jagged. And if you zoom really, really close in, you'd eventually see atoms, and there would be even more complexity than you thought. All of that can be true while still acknowledging that the normal way of looking at things, the human's eye view of things, can be the truest thing, in fact, right? It's more true to say there are men and there are women, there are two sexes in the world, and they are different. And everybody, you can tell by looking basically which is which. And there are some edge cases and exceptions, but there are exceptions that prove the rule, right? Because they prove that there is this outline around this category called woman. So that's how I use the word woman. I think it's how any person that wants to maintain a sane use of the language will use it. Then you get to this whole thing about sex and gender, right? A term, I think, coined, but certainly popularized by this guy, John Money, in the 50s. And like one of the original sort of okay groomers, like this guy was a real creep and did sort of gross experiments on kids and all of this stuff. But his main legacy, despite that shady past, is that he invented this idea that you have your sex, your biological sex, your sort of physical reality, and then you have your gender, which is sort of your inner feeling of self, right? And this has now become so Platonized, so intensely Cartesian and dualist, that your gender is this sort of like how you feel about yourself, completely irrespective of your body, unrelated to your body. And I think that like a lot of conservatives are now arguing that we should simply scrap the term gender because it's made up. There isn't a gender. There's just sex. Like, human beings have two sexes. They don't have genders. Languages have genders. That a gender is sort of an abstract concept. And I think that like there's a lot of truth to that. I think certainly the way that the word gender is used now is this sort of magical fairy unicorn realm of your abstract being. In essence, is like highly Gnostic and totally unhelpful. I also think though that we have talked a lot about on the show that like, manhood and masculinity are not entirely the same thing as maleness. And even you might go a step further and say that the manly virtues are human virtues. And so whereas we think of men as uniquely tasked with exhibiting things like courage, we don't think that women are incapable of courage or that it's not good for them to have courage, right? And so I would say that what we have, call it a gender or whatever, that there are also there's a spiritual dimension to each human sex. And that spiritual dimension, like all things, has properties which can be perverse and corrupted, or they can be virtuous and excellent. And so I would say aggression is like a male property. Most men in the aggregate can have more aggression, and that it's an ethically neutral property which can be directed in a virtuous or a vicious way. In feminine terms, I would say, for instance, that like creativity is a sort of a feminine property. Nurturing is a good one. Nurturing is a feminine property. Again, men can have it. It's good for men to have it, actually. But we don't expect men to have it, and we don't consider it quite as as bad if a man lacks it. We consider it more bad if a man lacks courage and if a woman lacks courage and so forth. Women have a nurturing property, which can be directed toward the cultivation of communities and the raising of children and the building of families, or it can be directed toward sort of smothering manly instinct and bothering everybody all the time. And like each of these properties has a virtuous and a vicious aspect, but there is a spiritual dimension to womanhood, just as there is a spiritual dimension to manhood. And our spirits are, in fact, although they are embedded and encoded in our bodies, they do transcend our bodies. And so the thing that the leftists are talking about when they talk about gender is not like a non-existent thing. They're just, as always, they're taking a truth and perverting it into this like wholly destructive madness. But that's why I have a little asterisk when people say like, there's no such thing as gender. Like there is a spiritual dimension to sex and to male and female. But a woman, everybody knows what a woman is. XX chromosomes, have ovaries, like produce, and if like there are women who don't do that, and like postmenopausal women or whatever, all still count because the species, right? Just as you are a member of the human species, even if you are brain dead, right? Even if you can't exercise your rational faculties, you are still the type of thing that can have those rational faculties, and therefore certain things apply to you, like the right to life. Similarly, even if you are a woman who's had a hysterectomy, right, and so the physical markers of womanhood are no longer there, you're still a member of that. You're a member of that species. It's obvious that that's true. In order to use language meaningfully, we have to accept that it's obvious, and so everybody knows what a woman is, and we should stand by that. Thanks for that question. I think Matt Walsh has done a really fascinating and excellent thing with raising it because he's sort of placed his finger on this like. It's a classic troll move, but it's bigger than that. It just aggravates so much. It just identifies exactly where this stuff breaks down. That's it for me. I will see you next week. If you like this show, as always, you will love the Claremont Institute. It's where I work. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. If you like the stuff that I've been saying on this show about the multiverse, I've got an essay on the multiverse coming out in the Claremont Review of Books. In the next issue, we just released an issue that you would really like. I highly encourage you to check it out. ClaremontReviewBooks.com, AmericanMind.org, and help support us by donating at claremont.org/donate. That's it for me. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.